The Forked Ways. Chapter 12. Encounters. Fletch was on the school bus. The labyrinth, the forest itself, had completely vanished. No other passengers were on the bus, and it was hard to make out the driver through the scratched plexiglass panel. He touched the Bluebird logo on the pebbled back of the seat in front of him. It felt solid, as did the stiff green cover of the seat itself. What could have happened? Had he dreamed or imagined running away to the woods? Had he really gone up to the highway and boarded the bus instead? Or was he dreaming now? He tugged his shirt back on and looked around, hoping to confirm that the school bus was no more than an illusion. On the seat across the aisle lay a paperback book, and he slid over and picked it up. It had a cover of blue and red, on which a crescent moon gleamed in a starlit sky. The Lollard's Brew of Tares. Fletch opened it, thinking it might provide a clue to what was happening, but the sentences were enigmatic, seemingly without order. Each night is separate, slow, and strange, and blessed with quiet water and the sound of wings. The years are grain upon the fields. They are a dark, swift smoke of stars, a flock of silver stones over which the moon rolls in uneasy sleep. Angel winds and devil winds whisper in my ears, and I remember and foresee the scent of autumn hideaways, the taste of fear, compassion, and regret. The book was meaningless, he decided. The words looped and spiraled, difficult to follow. He stood and made his way to the front of the bus, taking the book along. The driver of the bus was his father. "Of all people, I didn't expect to see you here," Fletch told him. Mark smiled at Fletch's open-mouthed astonishment. "Don't see why not. Times like this, you ask your own questions and you find your own answers, but it does help to have someone wise and wonderful like me to talk to." He glanced at the highway and swerved to avoid a pothole. "Sit down. It's not a good idea to stand up while the bus is moving." Fletch chose the seat nearly opposite. He counted his fingers, 5 on one hand, 5 on the other. He could see scratches from the briars in the woods. How could anybody tell if they were dreaming? "Dad, if this is real, where the hell are we going?" "To school," he said, as if the answer should have been obvious. "School doesn't help, Dad. It's all coefficients and sentence diagrams. I don't care about it anymore. Makes me feel sick, and I'd rather not go." His father nodded. "I guess I can accept that decision, at least for the time being. So, what are you going to do?" "You ever read The Three Little Pigs?" "Sure, once upon a time." "Well, I'm going to find the wicked old wolf." His father frowned and shifted into a lower gear. The bus slowed to a crawl, and Fletch saw they were entering a broad area of marshland. Tall grass waved in the sun. Dragonflies sailed past the windows. Ahead of them, beyond the brown water, the sky had a sour, dark yellow tint. So, it was a dream after all. This place definitely wasn't on the bus route. There wasn't even any road to speak of, just the remnants of what might once have been an old logging trail. "This is a dangerous choice, Fletch," Mark warned. "The wolf has no pity. Letting him eat you up won't keep him from eating anyone else. Not Silver, not me. Feeding him won't stop him." He pointed to the copy of the Lollard's Brew of Tares. "There's something in there you should read. Hand it over." He took the book and searched through it, keeping one eye on the hazardous track through the swamp. "Here you go." Fletch took the book and looked at the passage. "A blessing on the beast which the man devours, so the beast will become a man. A curse on the man which the beast devours, so the beast will become a man." "I've heard that before," Fletch said. "I remember you using it in a sermon once." "I thought you slept through all of them," his father said with a grin. "But you see what it says, don't you? If you let the wolf eat you up, you'll be cursed, and he will become what you are. But if you devour him, you will bless him and make him human." So how am I supposed to do that? Boil him in a pot when he tries to come down the chimney? You should know the answer, Fletch. What gave you strength in the past? A leaf of sage, a cup of acorns, a pouch of tobacco, a handful of wildflowers. The forked ways, Fletch began. Yes, the forked ways. Learn to travel them and you'll find power over the wolf, and more besides. No matter how he huffs and puffs, your house will stand strong. I thought they were here, Fletch told him. I mean in the woods. I almost saw them once in the clearing when I was there with Silver. They're real paths, all around us, invisible. But the clearing is a way in. Why don't you go back there? It's more hospitable than the swamp, and safer too. Fletch nodded. His father brought the bus to a stop and opened the folding doors. Fletch stepped down, not into the swamp, but into the middle of the clearing, and when he turned to look back, the bus was gone. But of course it was gone. It hadn't really been there in the first place. He looked down at the T-shirt still clenched in his hand. I'm awake, he realized. Maybe a minute ago I was asleep, but I'm awake now. How long have I been standing here? The circling woods began abruptly at an impenetrable wall of honeysuckle and blackberry bushes. There were no clipped branches or stumps of invading saplings. The clearing appeared to be able to care for itself. Fletch spent the evening listening, trying to open his awareness to the forked ways. When twilight came and he went back to camp, he was less afraid of what might happen during the night. The shadows between the tree roots grew deeper and spread out to cover the ground. The range of his senses diminished. Not only his eyes, but his ears and nostrils felt clogged with the dark. Apart from the sickle, the only weapon he had brought along was an ugly knife from the Second World War. When he zipped himself inside the tent for the night, he made sure that it was within reach. The knife might not do much to stop a creature like the wolf, but if it came poking its forked tongue through the tent flap, he intended to try it and see. Then, as an extra precaution, he crawled out and scattered the last of Silver's remade tobacco in a circle around the tent, thinking it might offer some protection during the night. When he finally reached something like sleep, Fletch remained dimly aware of where he was, unable to slip past the outer fringes of unconsciousness. The sound of something moving in the gully shocked him into alertness. He crouched in the tent, gripping the knife and trying not to breathe. After a minute he groped for the flashlight and slid to the front of the tent, realizing the flimsy nylon would offer no protection against attack. Quickly he unzipped the flap and crawled out, then stood up and switched on the light. Leaves and branches came into stark white relief, but it was hard to see beyond the nearest circle of trees. No sound came from the gully. The light had silenced the frogs and cicadas. "If you want me," he said aloud, "I'm here." His voice shocked the night. Something thrashed in the gully, and Fletch swung the light toward the sound. It was a fawn. The little deer leapt to the higher ground on the far side and fled, its white tail waving. Fear drained from his limbs, leaving him weak. If deer were browsing in the area, surely the wolf wasn't close by. He crawled back inside the tent and grew even more relieved when the frogs resumed their chant. As weird and unearthly as it sounded, the noises meant safety. He missed Silver, needed him. If he were here, he would be able to sleep in peace. Was he some kind of parasite that could only survive by drawing strength from other people? Did he love Silver not for who he was, but because he filled some selfish need of his own? If that was the case, he was really no better than the wolf. They both lived by feeding on the souls of others, only the wolf did so openly, while he disguised his rapaciousness as friendship and affection. Maybe he did belong to the wolf after all. The first half of the night he tossed fitfully on the hard ground, but at last slid into a deep, unbroken sleep. When he awoke, it was well into morning, and he found that the wolf had come by. The fawn he had seen earlier lay in the middle of the camp, savagely gutted. Its entrails had been drawn out so that they lay in a ragged pattern around the tent, just outside the ring of tobacco. Fletch was stunned, sickened, and enraged. He dragged the carcass of the fawn away from the camp, but found he couldn't stand to remain near the blood-soaked ground. Whenever he looked at it, it seemed to rise and sink, as if the earth beneath it were unstable. Shaken, he set out to look for another camp. He followed the ravine until it broadened and bottomed out. Not far away was a tree with a hole in it about 2 feet up the trunk. Around the hole, a yellow-brown mat like a growth of fungus shifted and shimmered before his eyes. He stared at it, puzzled. Part of the mat moved, dislodged itself, and broke up. They were either bees or yellow jackets, he couldn't tell which, but there were hundreds of them. A year ago he had been stung by 3 yellow jackets, and the fingers of his left hand had swollen up like sausages. Carefully, Fletch backed away. He had no quarrel with them, but the forest no longer seemed like a haven of safety. Dangers lurked everywhere, and he had no doubt that the wolf could make use of any of them it wished. Finally, he found a good spot above Vagabond Creek. It took most of the morning to move the tent and set up camp again. After he finished, he climbed down the bank to the water. The creek was narrow here, much depleted by lack of rain. All morning he had felt defiled by the slaughter of the fawn. Here at the stream, he peeled off his clothes and tried to wash away some of the horror, along with the grime of the day spent in the woods. The white clay of the creek bed was more malleable and smooth than typical Georgia red clay. He covered his fingers with a thin coating of slip, which quickly dried in the sun, and absently began to coat his body with the clay, using it almost like soap. Instead of washing it off, he found a sunny spot where he lay back and let it dry and crackle on his skin. When he finally allowed the stream to loosen and carry it off, he felt purified, as if much of his bitterness had been drawn out and washed away. His anger, however, had not lessened in the least. As soon as his skin was dry, he dressed in fresh clothes. Then he left the camp and followed the deer trail for about half an hour until it met a disused logging road. The morning air smelled clean, though the sparse dew had evaporated. There were bright places in the woods where the sun was warming the pine needles. On the clay banks, blue morning glories and pale yellow mushrooms stretched out toward the light. A fat orb weaver with orange legs had spun an immense web across the entire width of the road. The central area alone was bigger than a stop sign. To avoid disturbing it, he made a detour off the trail and was suddenly enveloped by a terrifying rush of noise. He let out a frantic shout before discovering, to his chagrin, that he had only disturbed a hidden covey of quail. Before long, he came to one of the old wagon roads which had passed through the harbor plantation, and followed it until it crossed the trail which he and Silver had taken to the swamp. He was about to turn down the trail when he saw someone watching him from further along the road. Fletch lifted his hand, and the figure motioned for him to approach. At first he thought it was a man in a broad-brimmed hat, dressed in camouflage like a hunter. Then it seemed as if he were wearing a jacket of woven leaves. When Fletch reached the spot, he saw that the figure wasn't a man at all, only a bush with a long branch, which he had taken for a beckoning arm. Having come this far, he felt compelled to continue following the old road. Though he kept a close watch, the man he had seen, or imagined, did not reappear. The road met the edge of an overgrown field, then cut back into the deep woods, curving down toward the swamp. Eventually he came to the banks of Vagabond Creek and saw the ruins of a bridge. Just downstream was a broad, stony place, which might once have served as a wagon ford, but the road cut to the left and continued upstream. If there had been a choice, he would have crossed the stream and kept to his original direction, but the woods on the opposite bank were so thick that whatever road had once been there was now impassable. The woods thinned as he came upon a junction where several straggling paths led past sagging gates into a series of neglected pastures. Just past the curve of the road, he found an ancient mailbox nailed to a fence post. A red wasp flew lazily past, landed on the mailbox, and crawled inside. Beyond it, he could see the empty shell of a small house. Other houses stood further along the road on either side, all of them empty and in ruins. In front of one, a white Ford Fairlane rusted in the weeds. The place was absolutely silent. He was at the edge of a small community, completely abandoned, which must have stood that way for interminable years. Fletch kept to the middle of the road, avoiding the blind stare of the windows as he passed. There were 3 houses on the left, 2 on the right. Y, Heller, Harper. The faded names on the old mailboxes chilled him, though he couldn't grasp why. The road curved to the left again, and he heard a dog barking. One more house lay ahead of him, and it was inhabited, though it appeared well on its way toward becoming as derelict as its companions. The name on the mailbox was Will's. At first he thought no one was home but the dog, which was tied to a cement block in the yard. Then he saw Carla behind the house, hanging clothes on a wire strung between 2 posts. She turned to see what was troubling the dog and gasped, nearly dropping the sodden heap of clothes. It was plain that she wasn't used to visitors appearing from the direction he had come. She edged closer to the dog, then recognized him. "Fletch Forrester? Lord, you gave me a turn." She came out to the road, smiling, and brushing back a loose strand of hair with a free hand. Her face was pale and pinched, as if she had lived with uneasiness for a long time. "I've been out hiking," he told her, trying to make his voice reassuring. "There's an old logging road which comes up along the stream. I must have made it nearly back to the highway." She nodded. "It's about a quarter of a mile further on. This road comes out at the bait shop." She glanced up toward the hill. "Cotton's up there today instead of me. Had a bad accident at work." Fletch was suddenly conscious of how odd he must look, his long hair bound with a rag and plastered with sweat, the sickle strapped to his belt. He felt odd, too, out of balance. Fleetingly he wondered whether Carla Wills might be part of another vision. It occurred to him that he needed tobacco for protection, and that it might be sold at the bait shop. The dog by the house whined, and Carla turned toward it. Fletch saw that the side of her face and neck were bruised. He understood what had happened, and wished there was something he could do. It occurred to him that Dwight had probably turned into the cruel person he was because of the abuse he must suffer at home. And suddenly he found himself hating Cotton Wills far more than he hated Dwight. Fletch hadn't realized he had left the Wills' house until he was halfway up the road to the bait shop. He wasn't exactly sure why he was heading that way, or what he would do when he got there, but something within him was pushing him, something he scarcely recognized as his own will. The bait shop looked like a log cabin with a tin roof. It was well kept, and Fletch suspected this might be because Carla ran the place more often than her husband. Out front by the gas pumps was a large white sign with black plastic letters. "Stop here for beer, worms, ice. We have Minners." Inside it was dark and cool. Cotton Wills was behind the counter, a man of about his father's age, but more strongly built. His white hair was cut short, almost to the skull, but the darker stubble on his chin was well on its way to becoming a beard. One hand was bound in white gauze. He was attending to a customer, someone Fletch didn't recognize, but he cast a curious glance his way as he entered. Tobacco, Fletch thought. That's what I need. More tobacco to keep the wolf at bay. He searched the shelves and saw cigarettes on a rack behind the counter, along with several brands of chewing tobacco and snuff. On the counter by the cash register stood a row of glass jugs containing pickles, pig's feet, and fat pink sausages. Groceries occupied the front of the store, while the back was devoted to bait and fishing tackle. A metal rack offered an assortment of faded comic books, The House of Mystery, Space Family Robinson. Fletch moved to the back of the store to wait until Cotton had finished with the man at the counter. A plaque on the wall displayed a large-mouthed bass, with a head at each end of its body. An array of colorful lures filled the racks, beautiful transparent worms, turquoise, lavender, and scarlet. There were long glass tanks, lit from behind, with silver minnows in them, and styrofoam ice chests where red wigglers and sleek black lizards hid in pungent earth. Fletch felt he could stay there for days, lost in the cool blue-green light and quietly moving water. "What's up, boy?" Cotton Will's voice came from the front of the shop. It sounded slightly amused, a bit too familiar for addressing someone he scarcely knew. "You looking to go fishing?" Fletch recognized the man's tone from his dreams about the wolf, and he moved to the front of the shop cautiously. Cotton had leaned back in something resembling an old dentist chair, the creaking leather patched with duct tape. "You the preacher's kid, ain't you?" Fletch nodded. The man in front of him looked ordinary enough, but there was something about him which set off sparks of warning in the back of Fletch's brain. In the dim light of the shop, Cotton's eyes looked green. "I'd like to buy some pipe tobacco," Fletch told him. He kept his voice steady, though every muscle in his body felt taut, ready to spring. "What kind?" "Doesn't matter, any brand you've got." Fletch's eyes scanned the shelves. "How about Workhorse?" Cotton's eyes narrowed. "Workhorse," he said patiently, "is chewing tobacco." He placed a pouch of Sir Walter Raleigh on the counter. "I believe you're underage. Not that I give a shit. That'll be $1.50. Fletch put 2 sticks of beef jerky beside the tobacco. Cotton rang it up. "Anything else for you?" Fletch looked at him steadily. "I want you to stop hitting Carla and Dwight." Cotton remained motionless. Only his eyes registered surprise, and the look passed as quickly as it had come. "I hear you're part nigger, is that right?" Cotton placed his uninjured hand on the counter and leaned forward slightly. "I don't hold that against you. I'm the nigger's best friend, as long as he's content to remain a nigger. That means keeping your nose out of a white man's business. You understand me, boy?" Fletch nodded. "Yes, sir, I understand." What followed seemed to take forever, though it must have happened in scarcely a moment. Fletch slipped the sickle from his belt, grasped it in both hands, and brought it down point first with all the strength in his body. The heavy blade went right through the back of Cotton's hand, and the force behind it sent the point an inch deep into the wooden countertop. Cotton Wills froze in place. His eyes widened, and even before he screamed, he managed to utter a word in relative calmness. "Oppositioner." You weren't just driving by. Mark Forrester met Elizabeth Kendall at the door of the studio. "I hope you don't mind my dropping by. I brought that album we talked about, the Deller Consort, Renaissance Madrigals." Liz looked at him in amusement. "I've been listening to John Dowland all morning. Come in, we'll put it on the stereo." She led him into the studio and watched as he approached the painting she had been working on. "Have you heard anything from Fletch?" Mark shook his head. "He's still out in the woods. I'm trying to decide whether to give him some space or go hunting for him. He feels responsible for Silver's fall, and he's got a lot of things on his mind." "You mean about being chosen? I wasn't sure you'd talked to him about that." "I haven't. There's not going to be any choosing. As far as I'm concerned, it's not even an issue to be addressed. People don't sacrifice their children anymore." Liz shook her head. "Tell that to Betsy." "I have," Mark said with a tight smile. "She's insistent. I love her and I respect her, but Fletch is my son, and I won't be persuaded." "There's one thing you're forgetting, I think," Liz said gently, "and that's Fletch's own choice in the matter." Mark didn't respond. He turned to the painting before him and studied it. "Fletch told me about this," he murmured. "He said something about it having to do with Gustav Mahler." Liz accepted the change of subject. "I know, it sounds a bit trite. I can't help where my ideas come from. The painting's non-objective. It shouldn't be read as a narrative, but it did come from wrestling with the Second Symphony, his sense of resurrection. I guess you can relate to that with your background. But Mahler was Jewish, you know, and I wonder if he wasn't being at least partly ironic." Mark nodded. He was grateful that Liz had not pressed him to talk any further about Fletch. "You want to know something strange?" he asked her. "I used to think the resurrection was a metaphor, but I don't anymore. I think it really happened. The end of the world somehow folded back into a moment in time and changed everything." Mark stopped and looked at her. "Am I babbling? I do that when I'm nervous." Liz smiled. "Mark, I suppose this is as good a time as any to tell you. Silver's religious, but I'm more atheist than not. I hope it doesn't inhibit our friendship." Mark shook his head. "Actually, if you want to know the truth, I have a sneaking suspicion that God is an atheist." Liz laughed. "Well, if that's true, it's nice to know that he and I have something in common. I was getting ready to go down to the house for a sandwich with Silver. It's bologna, of course. Would you like one?" "Actually, I have a picnic basket in the car. Pasta with pesto, cheese, olives, some fruit, a bottle of Chianti. We can incorporate the bologna." She stared at him. "You weren't just driving by." He shrugged. "Been planning this for the better part of a week." She smiled. "Well then, I know the perfect spot." These Old Buildings. Forby and Ellie Banks looked on as Landry Wise smashed the wrecking bar through the plaster and lath of the barbershop wall. He hooked it securely, bracing his foot against the wall, and heaved backwards, bringing a small avalanche of crumbling debris down around him. Several people from town had stopped by to watch the unprecedented demolition. They were doubtful at first. Was Forby serious? Would men and women be getting their hair cut in the same shop from now on? In the same room? Ellie assured everyone that it was true. It had been a long time coming, but it was the right thing to do. The men seemed more nervous about it than the women. What, Josh Avery inquired, would they do with the brass spittoons? The wall was thicker than Landry had expected. In fact, it turned out to be a double wall with a vacancy between, now filled with trash and dust. "Hey, Forby, look at this." Landry reached into the rubble and tossed out a moldy book. It appeared to be a collection of statistical tables related to North Georgia school districts in the late 1800s. More remarkable was the fact that pasted onto several of the pages were sheets covered in careful but childish handwriting. Forby handed the book to Ellie. "Look here, sugar, treasure already." Ellie Banks looked close at the writing. Maxims, doggerel, little essays and editorials, all compiled by a group of children a century ago. With fear and trembling do we, the editors, submit our first attempts as journalists. We ask the sympathy and good fellowship of all our brothers and sisters, and will say, as did the dervish of old, we'll never do it again. Whoever gets angry at our jokes as a punishment will be ejected by the janitor. The Gainesville Mule Camp Springs crowd. Alice Moon, Editor-in-Chief. Ellie laughed in delight. "Papa, some kids used this book. They had some sort of club. Look, this is so funny." Forby took the book and peered over his glasses at the writing. "In Tadmor lived Franklin Heller, a pretty good sort of a fella, who took a long skate and fell on his pate, which made Mr. Franklin H. Bella." Forby chuckled. "You never know what you'll find in these old buildings." He looked up just as Landry fell back with a stifled exclamation of shock. Someone else in the room, Florence Avery perhaps, screamed. "What?" Forby began in confusion. But then he saw what Landry had uncovered in the void between the walls. "Oh, mercy," he whispered. "God's sweet mercy." Small Bones, still dressed in rotted clothing, tumbled to the floor.